The night the trouble began didn't look any different from the others. The city was winding down, lights glowing in rows like tired eyes, and the courthouse district sat in its usual silence, the kind that made footsteps echo a little too loudly. The old brick buildings stood still under their shadows stretched long across the pavement. It was late autumn, the kind of cold that sank into your clothes and made people walk faster without knowing why. Inside the courthouse, cleaners moved quietly from room to room, unaware that in just a few days, those same halls would turn into a storm of confusion, anger, and disbelief. Across town, far from the stillness of the courthouse, the people who would soon collide in that courtroom were living what looked like simple, ordinary lives. None of them could see how close they were to something that would tear those lives apart. The man at the center of it all lived in a small apartment on the third floor of an old building. The walls carried the smell of cooked onions and old paint, and the upstairs neighbors walked like they never learned what the word quiet meant. He kept to himself, lived with his routines, and kept his eyes lowered when passing strangers. To most people, he seemed calm, like someone who didn't make trouble. But there was something about him, something in the way he always seemed to be holding back a thought he didn't want others to see. People who knew him said he talked as if he were afraid someone might twist his words. He hated being misunderstood, hated feeling small. He wanted control in every situation, even the ones that didn't need controlling. A few blocks away lived the woman who would one day become the key witness. She worked long hours and tried her best not to drown in the weight of her responsibilities. She had a kind face, but her eyes carried a tiredness that no amount of sleep could fix. Life hadn't given her much room to breathe. She lived in a small rented room above a convenience store, where the hum of the refrigerators below blended into a constant buzz. People walked past her every day without noticing her, and she had grown used to being unseen. But she watched everything. She had learned early on that knowing more than people realized could be the only way to stay safe. She never expected that the things she had seen, small, everyday things that looked harmless at the time, would soon pull her into a courtroom filled with pressure she never wanted. Then there was the one who would become the victim, someone who looked strong on the outside but carried fear just beneath the surface. He lived in a nicer part of the city, a place with trimmed hedges, clean sidewalks, and houses that looked nearly the same. He had a good job, a steady income, and the respect of people who barely knew him. But behind closed doors, he lived with a different reality. He had been dealing with a person who pushed too hard, someone who always wanted more control than he could give. Their relationship, professional at first, had slowly turned into something twisted, something built on pressure and hidden threats. He tried to keep the peace, tried to convince himself he could handle it, but every day it felt like the walls around him were closing in. He felt watched, judged, and trapped in a situation he didn't fully understand. He didn't tell anyone. He thought it would get better on its own. He was wrong. These three people, each living in their own corner of the city, had no idea how tightly their lives would soon be tied together. None of them knew that the decisions they made in the coming days would end up in front of a judge who had seen more lies and broken promises than most people could ever imagine. And out of all the cases that the judge had handled, this one would make him freeze in disbelief when the defendant suddenly stood up and said, "This is not what I agreed to." But before that moment, before the shouting, the confusion, the shock, everything appeared normal. The streets were quiet. The city lights flickered like they always did. People moved through their routines, unaware of the cracks forming beneath their feet. The man who would become the defendant wasn't always difficult to read, but he had a habit of thinking everyone was against him. Small things bothered him more than they should. A late reply, a short answer, a look that lingered too long. He took these things as disrespect, as challenges. What he wanted more than anything was to feel powerful, to feel like he was the one calling the shots. And when life didn't give him that, he tried to force it. That need, sharp and hungry, was always there, waiting. The witness, meanwhile, lived in constant uncertainty. She was used to fear, but this time it felt different, heavier. Something she noticed months earlier had stayed in her mind, something she didn't share with anyone because she didn't want to get involved. She told herself it was none of her business. She told herself she didn't see enough to matter. But deep down, she knew the truth. What she saw was enough to ruin someone. And that knowledge, quiet and heavy, followed her everywhere. The victim tried to move through life the same way he always had, but his hands shook when he thought no one was looking. He had caught on too late to the danger creeping closer to him. He sensed something was coming, something he couldn't avoid, and he hated how powerless he felt. The world outside kept moving like everything was normal, but inside him, panic built day by day. He told himself to stay calm, not to show fear, but fear never listened. The city around them felt calm, but there was a wrongness in the air, a tension that only showed itself when you looked closely. Conversations felt sharp. Small arguments escalated faster than usual. People seemed on edge without knowing why. It was like the city itself could sense trouble creeping in, something that would grow into a courtroom scene that no one present would ever forget. Life still went on. People cooked dinner, argued over bills, rushed to work, kissed their kids goodnight. But behind this normal world, something darker was forming. Power was shifting. Control was slipping. Lines between right and wrong were starting to blur, and the people caught in the middle were too distracted by their daily struggles to notice the danger rising around them. Nothing about that week gave away what was coming. No warning sirens, no sudden signs, just small moments, quick, subtle, easy to ignore, that slowly pulled 3 lives toward a disaster none of them could escape. The courtroom lights would soon shine on them all. But for now, they lived in a fragile calm, unaware that their world was already cracking beneath their feet. The weeks that followed carried a quiet pressure that none of them could shake, even though they tried to pretend nothing was wrong. It began with small things, little moments that would have seemed harmless if you didn't look closely. But each one pushed the 3 of them toward a place that none of them were ready for, tightening the invisible rope that tied their lives together. The man who would become the defendant grew restless in a way that made people around him uneasy. He paced more, his jaw always tight, his eyes sharp like he was waiting for someone to make a mistake. Even simple questions made him tense. He noticed the change but didn't comment. He wasn't the type of person you questioned unless you wanted trouble. He had always struggled with feeling overlooked, but now that feeling turned into something like bitterness. It ate at him from the inside, telling him that people respected him less than he deserved, that he had to prove something, that he was being pushed aside. His irritation sharpened when he thought about the man he'd been dealing with, the one who would later be the victim. He started to convince himself that he was being used, that he wasn't getting the credit or control he deserved. In reality, their disagreements were small at first, but he interpreted every comment, every look, every delay as a sign of disrespect. He wanted to feel powerful, but instead, he felt like someone else was holding the upper hand, and that burned more than he cared to admit. One night after a long day where nothing went his way, he sent the victim a message that sounded polite on the surface but carried a sharp undertone. Something like, "We need to talk. Things aren't going the way we agreed." The victim read it slowly, feeling a cold anxiety settle in his stomach. He answered with calm words, trying to keep the peace, but he sensed danger. He had sensed it for weeks now, in the way the man spoke to him, in the way he tried to push for more control, in the way his eyes changed when he didn't get what he wanted. The witness saw the start of the tension long before she understood what it meant. She had seen them together once, an interaction that might have seemed normal to anyone else, but to her, the air around them felt tight. The defendant's smile was too forced. The victim looked like someone trying to avoid setting off a fire. She didn't hear their words clearly, only bits and pieces, but it didn't take much to know something was wrong. She didn't tell anyone because she didn't want to be dragged into their problems. But the moment stayed in her mind like a stain she couldn't scrub out. The defendant's jealousy grew slowly, almost like a sickness. He hated seeing the victim talk to anyone else with ease, hated how people seemed to respect him more. To him, it wasn't just admiration, it was proof that the victim held a kind of power he could never reach. And once the idea took root, it twisted everything he saw. Every neutral comment became a hidden insult. Every boundary became an attack. He started digging into the victim's life, looking for weaknesses, mistakes, or secrets he could use. It wasn't hard to find things. Everyone has something they don't want to share. He found financial issues that the victim had tried to hide, old arguments with family members, and rumors about a past relationship that ended badly. None of these things mattered on their own, but in the defendant's hands, they became weapons. He told himself he wasn't doing anything wrong. He was just protecting himself. But deep down, he knew he wasn't being honest. The victim, meanwhile, felt the pressure closing in. Work became harder. Bills piled up. Someone had been giving his name to people he owed money to, stirring up old trouble he had tried to outrun. He suspected who was behind it, but he didn't want to believe it. He didn't want to believe that someone he had tried to work with, someone he once trusted, was now trying to tear him apart. His nights became sleepless. His thoughts turned dark. The feeling of being watched followed him everywhere. He looked over his shoulder when walking home. He double-checked his locks. He felt like someone was waiting for him to slip, to fall, to break. He didn't know how deeply the defendant's resentment had grown, how much time he spent studying him, analyzing him, waiting for a chance to strike back. The witness's life didn't get easier either. She struggled with money and worked extra shifts just to keep up with rent. The noise from the store below her room kept her awake. But what bothered her even more was the growing sense that she was somehow standing too close to a situation that was building into something dangerous. She overheard conversations she wasn't meant to hear, frustrated mutters, angry phone calls, nervous steps at strange hours. Once she saw the defendant standing outside her building late at night, staring down the street with a look that shook her. He didn't see her watching from the window. She didn't tell anyone about it, afraid that speaking it out loud would make it real. Rumors were spreading through the neighborhood about the defendant's past, things he had done years earlier. A fight that ended badly, a deal that fell apart and left someone injured, a relationship that had turned violent behind closed doors. Nothing was proven, nothing official, but people whispered. And those whispers soon made their way to the victim, who began to understand just how dangerous the man really was. He tried to distance himself, but every attempt made the defendant angrier. Their meetings turned into arguments. Their voices rose. Neighbors heard shouting through thin walls. The victim tried to walk away, but the defendant always found a way back into his life, always pushing, always demanding, always twisting the truth until he painted himself as the one being wronged. The witness watched the arguments from a distance, feeling a knot tighten in her chest. She wanted to stay out of it, but she couldn't unsee the growing rage in the defendant's eyes. She couldn't ignore how the victim looked smaller every time she saw him, like the weight on him was crushing his ability to stand tall. As the weeks passed, the defendant's obsession sharpened. He convinced himself the victim was trying to cheat him, trying to ruin him, trying to take away something that belonged to him. He replayed every conversation in his mind, twisting words until they became insults that had never actually been spoken. His anger fed on itself, growing heavier each day. He stopped eating well. He stopped sleeping. His world narrowed down to one person, one problem, one target. On the outside, life looked the same. People passed each other on sidewalks without noticing the storm building beneath the surface. But for the three of them, every day felt more unstable than the last. The defendant started following the victim without realizing how far he was going. At first, he told himself he just wanted answers. Then he convinced himself he needed proof of lies he made up in his own mind. He stood behind parked cars, pretended to tie his shoe while watching from afar, and memorized the victim's schedule. His mind twisted simple actions into betrayals. If the victim met someone for lunch, he imagined they were planning to ruin him. If the victim left early from work, he imagined secret meetings behind his back. The victim noticed the shadow behind him long before he saw who it was. He felt the eyes watching him, felt his body tighten with fear each time he walked down a dark street. When he finally saw the defendant standing across the road one night, staring at him without blinking, something inside him broke. He went home shaking, his hands cold, his breath shallow. He knew things had gone too far. He knew he wasn't safe anymore. The witness kept collecting small pieces of the truth even when she didn't try to. Sounds through walls, arguments on the street, a slammed door, a cry for help. And once she heard something she would never forget, the defendant's voice, low and furious, saying, "He thinks he can walk away from me. He has no idea what's coming." That night, she locked her door twice. None of them realized how much their pasts played into the disaster forming between them. The defendant had always struggled with feeling powerless. As a child, he grew up in a home where yelling replaced understanding, where threats replaced comfort. He learned early on that the only way to avoid being hurt was to be the one in control. Those habits never left him. Every challenge became a threat. Every disagreement became a personal attack. The victim had grown up feeling responsible for everyone else, forced to fix problems he never caused. He avoided conflict because conflict had always led to pain. He swallowed fear instead of confronting it. He tried to stay calm even when his world cracked around him. But fear had started to grow roots inside him, roots that made him freeze instead of fight. The witness knew too well what fear looked like. She had lived through her own share of troubles, an ex who controlled her every move, a childhood full of silence and broken promises. She recognized the signs in others, even when they tried to hide them. As the pressure built, none of them slept well. None of them felt safe. The defendant's anger, the victim's fear, the witness's growing dread, all of it pushed them closer to the moment the world would finally break open. And when it did, it wouldn't happen quietly. It would happen in a way that would shake a courtroom, stun a judge, and leave everyone wondering how a normal life could fall apart so fast. But for now, tension kept rising, like water filling a room with no exit, and they were running out of air. The night of the crime began with a heavy stillness. the kind that presses against the chest and makes every sound feel louder than it should. The city streets were nearly empty, washed in a cold glow from streetlights that flickered above cracked sidewalks. A thin layer of fog clung to the ground, curling around the tires of parked cars and swallowing the edges of buildings. It looked like the kind of night where anything could happen, where something dark could slip through the quiet without anyone noticing until it was too late. The victim had been restless since morning. He felt something wrong in the air, a kind of warning he couldn't explain. All day, his hands shook when he tried to work, and he found himself checking the window for no reason other than the fear that someone was watching. He didn't know yet that the defendant had already made up his mind. Not fully, not in words, but in the slow, angry rhythm of a mind that had been poisoned by its own thoughts. Hours before the crime, the defendant stood alone in his apartment, the lights off, shadows stretching across the floor like long arms. His breathing was uneven, his chest tight. He didn't blink much anymore. His mind jumped between anger and hurt, between wanting control and wanting someone to blame for the emptiness he carried. He replayed every argument, every moment he felt dismissed, every time he imagined the victim talking down to him. Those memories twisted into something dark, something that told him he had been wronged in ways he couldn't ignore. He paced back and forth, gripping his phone so hard it hurt. He had told himself he just wanted to talk, to demand answers, to finally force respect from the man he hated more with each passing day. But as he stared at the screen, his thoughts drifted into darker places. He wasn't thinking straight anymore. His anger had become a storm he could no longer control. Finally, he grabbed his coat and stepped out into the cold night. His steps were fast, almost frantic, and his breath came out in clouds. People he passed on the street felt something off about him and moved out of his way without even understanding why. He didn't look at them. He didn't see anything except the picture in his head of the victim's face, calm, steady, the face he had twisted into a symbol of everything he felt. The victim left his apartment shortly after sunset, wanting air, needing space to think. He walked toward the empty lot behind an old warehouse, a place he sometimes went to clear his mind. The lot was quiet except for the hum of distant traffic and the soft creak of old metal signs swaying in the wind. The cold bit into his skin, but he didn't care. He was tired of living scared. He didn't know the defendant had followed him. He didn't know how close danger was, only steps behind him, hidden by fog and shadows. The witness wasn't supposed to be there at all, but fate has a way of pulling the wrong people into the wrong places at the worst times. She had taken a shortcut home to save time, her hands wrapped around her coat for warmth. She never liked walking near that warehouse because it felt too empty, too forgotten, but she was exhausted and didn't want to walk the long way around. She heard voices before she saw anything, one low and shaking, the other sharp like broken glass. The defendant called out the victim's name, his voice rough with anger. The victim froze, his breath catching in his throat. When he turned, he already knew this wasn't a conversation. This was something far worse. They stood several feet apart, the fog swirling between them. The streetlight above flickered, giving their faces flashes of light and shadow. The defendant looked different, his eyes wide, his jaw tight, his hands trembling with a kind of fury that came from deep inside. "You think you can just walk away from all of this?" he said, his voice breaking. "You think you can treat me like I'm nothing?" The victim lifted his hands, palms open. "I never did that. You're twisting everything. Please, we don't need to do this." But the defendant stepped closer, shaking his head like he couldn't hear anything but the lies he told himself. His thoughts raced, crashing into each other. In his mind, the victim wasn't someone trying to calm the situation. He was the enemy, the one who had taken his power, taken his voice, taken everything he believed he deserved. "You used me," he said, his voice barely controlled. "You made me think I mattered, then you pushed me aside." "I didn't push you aside," the victim whispered. Fear cracked through his voice, but he tried to stay calm. "You're not thinking clearly. Please, let's just breathe. We can talk." But the defendant wasn't listening. His heart pounded so loudly that he couldn't hear anything else. His hands clenched, and the cold metal he had hidden in his coat felt heavier with every second. He hadn't planned exactly what to do with it. He only knew it made him feel powerful, like he finally had control again. The witness stepped closer without meaning to, drawn by the intensity in their voices. She hid behind a dumpster, her hands shaking, her breath shallow. She knew she should run, but her legs wouldn't move. She watched as tension thickened in the air, as fear took shape right in front of her. The victim tried again, stepping slightly back, his voice shaking. "Think about this. You don't want to do something you can't take back." But those words, "you can't take back," pushed the defendant over the edge. To him, they sounded like a threat, like the victim was saying he'd report him, ruin him, expose him. His mind twisted the fear in the victim's eyes into mockery, and something snapped inside him. He lunged. The moment itself happened fast, too fast for anyone to process. A shout tore through the air. The witness gasped, covering her mouth with both hands. The streetlight flickered violently, plunging them in and out of darkness. In one horrifying instant, the defendant's rage took full control, blocking out reason, blocking out remorse, blocking out everything except the need to feel in charge, just once. The victim stumbled, shock written across his face. Pain shot through him like fire, stealing the air from his lungs. He tried to speak, but only a broken sound came out. His body trembled as he fell to his knees, hands shaking, eyes wide with disbelief. The defendant froze for a moment, staring down at what he had done. His chest rose and fell fast, his breath ragged. His mind, once filled with noise, suddenly went silent. He didn't feel the satisfaction he expected. He didn't feel in control. He felt sick, terrified, unsteady. The witness felt everything inside her collapse. She wanted to scream, but no sound came out. Her legs felt like water, her heart pounding so hard she thought she'd faint. She backed away slowly, trying not to make a sound, her mind spinning. She didn't want to be seen. She didn't want to be next. The victim reached out weakly, his fingers brushing the cold ground. His voice came out as a whisper, almost lost in the wind. Why did you do this?" The defendant shook his head over and over. "You made me," he whispered, though even he knew it wasn't true. The fog around them thickened, swallowing the scene in a cold haze. Then panic hit him all at once. He stepped back, his hands shaking uncontrollably. He looked around wildly, as if hoping no one saw, as if the truth could somehow be undone. His breath came out in quick gasps, his mind racing with desperate thoughts. Maybe he isn't dead. Maybe I can fix this. Maybe no one will know. He knelt down, his hands hovering helplessly over the victim. "Just get up," he begged. "Please, just get up. You're fine, you're fine." But the victim didn't move. The witness couldn't stay hidden anymore. She ran, her footsteps loud in the empty lot, her breath sharp in her throat. She didn't look back. She just ran, her whole body shaking, knowing she could never forget what she saw. The defendant heard her. A flash of fear shot through him. Someone had seen, someone knew. He stood there, torn between chasing her and collapsing beside the man he had just destroyed. His mind split in two, panic clawing through him, but he didn't move. His legs refused to work. For a long moment, the only sound was his breathing, fast, broken, desperate. The cold fog wrapped around him like a shroud, and he felt the crushing weight of what he had done settling onto his shoulders. The anger that had driven him here drained away, leaving behind only fear. He tried to steady himself, tried to tell himself it wasn't his fault, but every time he looked at the victim's still body, the truth slammed into him again. He had crossed a line he could never uncross. With shaking hands, he wiped at the scene, trying to erase pieces of the truth. He whispered to himself, convincing himself it was an accident, convincing himself he didn't mean to go this far. He found reasons, excuses, and lies to soften the reality. But lies didn't warm him. Lies didn't wake the man on the ground. When he finally fled the scene, his footsteps echoed across the empty lot like the last remnants of a life shattering. He kept looking over his shoulder, expecting someone to appear, expecting sirens to erupt from the darkness. But the night stayed silent. The witness didn't stop running until she reached her door. She locked it, slid down against it, and sobbed into her hands. Her mind replayed the scene again and again, each time worse than before. The victim lay alone in the fog, the cold settling into him while the city around him slept, unaware of the tragedy that had just unfolded. And the defendant, gripped by a fear so deep he could barely breathe, walked into the night with the weight of the crime pressing against him like a shadow he would never escape. The world had changed in that one violent moment, destroyed by anger, fear, and the desperate need for control. The hours after the crime were a blur of fear, confusion, and desperate thoughts. The defendant spent the first part of the night wandering through back streets, his steps unsteady and his thoughts tangled. He kept wiping his hands on his coat as if he could erase what he had done, as if cleaning the surface could somehow clean his mind. Every sound startled him. Every shadow made him jump. He couldn't tell if he was freezing because of the cold or because of the shock that had settled deep inside him. He told himself over and over that it wasn't his fault, that the victim had pushed him too far, that he hadn't meant for anything to happen. But no matter how many times he repeated the lie, the truth forced itself back into his mind. The victim's face, the look of disbelief, the weakness in his voice as he fell. Each memory hit him like a punch to the chest, stealing his breath. By morning, he hadn't slept. The sun rising only made things feel worse because daylight made it real. He washed his hands again and again, watching the water swirl down the drain. He tried to calm himself enough to think, but nothing made sense anymore. He thought about turning himself in, then thought about running, then thought about pretending nothing happened. His mind jumped through all of these thoughts like a broken machine, unable to settle. Meanwhile, the witness barely moved from her bedroom floor that night. She sat with her back against the door, knees pulled tight to her chest, staring at nothing. Her hands still shook. Every time she closed her eyes, she heard the victim's weak voice, saw the defendant's rage, felt her heart stop as she watched the moment play out. She didn't sleep either. How could she? She kept imagining the defendant finding out she was there. She kept imagining him coming after her next. As the sky brightened, she forced herself to stand, though her legs felt numb. She thought about going to the police, but fear clung to her like a second skin. What if they didn't believe her? What if the defendant found out she talked? What if they asked her questions she didn't know how to answer? She felt trapped between the fear of staying silent and the fear of speaking up. She didn't know yet that her decision, whatever it would be, would change everything. The victim was found early in the morning by a delivery driver cutting through the lot to save time. The man froze when he saw the body lying partly in the fog, clothes damp from the cold night. He dropped the box he was carrying and called for help with shaking his hands. Within minutes, sirens cut through the morning quiet, flashing lights painting the abandoned warehouse in red and blue. News spread quickly. People living nearby stepped outside in their pajamas and winter coats, whispering to each other, trying to see what was happening. The victim had been known by many. He wasn't perfect, but he was kind to most people, helpful enough that neighbors remembered small moments, helping someone carry groceries, offering a ride on a rainy day, talking to kids who hung out near the store. When word got out that he was dead, the shock rippled through the community like a crack spreading through glass. The police began asking questions, retracing the victim's last steps, talking to friends and family. They searched his phone, looked at his recent messages, and quickly noticed the tense exchanges with the defendant. Officers who had dealt with the defendant before knew he had a history of losing control, knew he had a temper, knew he carried grudges like heavy stones he couldn't put down. As the investigation moved forward, his name floated to the top of their list like oil rising to the surface of water. The defendant didn't know any of this. He spent the morning staring at himself in the bathroom mirror, barely recognizing the person looking back. His face looked pale and drawn, his eyes wide with fear. He felt hollow, as if the person who committed the crime had been someone else. He tried to convince himself that the victim was still alive when he left, that maybe someone else came later, that maybe he wasn't fully responsible. But even as the thoughts formed, his stomach twisted with guilt. His phone buzzed several times with messages, friends asking where he was, checking if he'd show up, the victim's name flashing on a community chat as people asked if anyone had seen him. The messages made him feel sick. The world kept moving, but he felt stuck in the moment of violence, unable to escape it. The witness saw the flashing lights from her window and felt her heart break all over again. She knew what they meant. She knew the victim hadn't survived. Her throat tightened and she pressed her hand against the cold glass. She thought about her own silence. She thought about how she should have gone to the police right away. Guilt wrapped around her like a chain, but fear still held her in place. People who knew the defendant were stunned when they heard he might be involved. Some refused to believe it. They said he was intense, yes, but not dangerous, not enough to do something like this. Others weren't surprised. They whispered about moments when he had snapped over small things, about stories they had heard over the years that suddenly made more sense. Public opinion split fast. Some defended him, saying he was being framed, that the victim had enemies. Others blamed him immediately, pointing to his temper, to his past, to the way he had always carried anger beneath the surface. The media caught the story within hours. News channels ran pictures of the victim smiling in better times, calling him a respected member of the community. They talked about the investigation, about possible motives, about the shock the crime had caused. They showed footage of the lot where he was found, the camera lingering on the taped-off area where officers moved carefully through the fog. By noon, rumors had spread far beyond the neighborhood. People who barely knew either man shared their opinions online, twisting stories, adding their own theories. Some blamed the crime in the area. Some blamed mental health. Some blamed the victim. Others blamed society, saying it was another example of how pressure and power struggles could destroy people. The defendant watched pieces of the news from his couch, his entire body frozen. When he saw the victim's picture on the screen, something inside him cracked again. He whispered an apology to no one in particular, to the empty room, to the ghost of the man he had destroyed. But the apology didn't fix anything. It didn't make the shaking in his hands stop. It didn't make the weight in his chest lighten. He tried to convince himself he could still run. He imagined taking a bag, walking out the door, disappearing. But every time he stood up, his legs gave out. And somewhere deep inside him, he knew running wouldn't change the truth. It wouldn't make him less guilty. For the victim's family, the news hit like a blow. His sister collapsed when she heard, her hands covering her mouth as if she could hold in the pain. His mother sat in silence, staring at a wall, unable to cry. His friends gathered outside the house, hugging each other, sharing memories, trying to understand how someone so alive yesterday could be gone today. His absence spread through their lives like a cold wind, touching everything. The witness finally went to the police late in the afternoon, her steps heavy, her heart racing. She walked into the station with her hands clenched and her eyes swollen from crying. When she told them she had seen the crime, the officers listened closely, taking notes, asking questions gently but firmly. She told them what she saw, the argument, the anger, the moment everything broke. She cried as she spoke. The guilt of waiting so long weighed down every word, but the officers didn't blame her. They saw her fear. They saw how deeply the moment had her. Her testimony became the missing piece the investigators needed. That evening, the police knocked on the defendant's door. He knew why they were there. He didn't fight. He didn't shout. He didn't try to run. He just opened the door slowly, his face pale, his eyes hollow. As the officers told him he was under arrest, he nodded, his voice barely a whisper when he said, "I know." Handcuffs clicked around his wrists, cold and final. Neighbors watched from their windows, whispering, pointing, pulling their children away from the sight. Some looked shocked. Others looked angry. A few looked almost relieved that the fear looming over the neighborhood might finally be lifting. As he was guided into the police car, he didn't look at anyone. He stared at the ground, feeling the weight of the moment settle heavily onto him. Everything he had tried to justify collapsed into one clear truth. He couldn't outrun what he had done. The community changed in subtle ways after that night. People walked a little faster past the empty lot. The fog near the warehouse seemed heavier. Parents held their kids closer. And every time someone mentioned the victim's name, a hush fell over the conversation. The defendant's family felt their own kind of pain. Some stood by him, saying he had made a mistake but wasn't a monster. Others pulled away, unable to understand how someone they loved had crossed such a terrible line. The guilt, the shame, the confusion, all of it tangled into something heavy they would carry for years. The witness slept with the light on for days. Sounds outside her window made her jump. But she tried to find strength in the fact that she finally spoke up, even if she wished she had done it sooner. The aftermath of the crime stretched out like long shadows, touching everyone involved in different ways. The defendant faced the reality of what he had done. The victim's loved ones faced a future without him. The witness faced the memories she wished she could forget. And the community, once unaware of the danger growing quietly among them, now lived with the truth that even normal-seeming lives can unravel in the darkest ways, leaving behind wounds that time would struggle to heal. In the months that followed the trial, life never settled back into the shape it once had. The town tried to pretend things were normal again, but there was a heaviness in the streets, something that hung between old buildings and familiar paths like a reminder that even quiet places hide storms. People still talked about the case in low voices, usually when they thought no one was really listening. The shock had faded, but the questions it raised stayed behind, stubborn and uncomfortable, like a bruise that refused to heal. Daniel sat alone most days, waiting for the final judgment that he already knew would not fall in his favor. Whatever anger had once pushed him forward had burned itself out long ago. Now he was left with a hollow kind of calm, the kind that comes when someone stops fighting because they finally understand they've already lost. His lawyers still visited him now and then, but their voices carried less hope each time. They no longer talked about possible loopholes or a chance at a lighter sentence. They spoke to him with the tone people use when they know the end of something is coming and don't want to say it out loud. He didn't argue anymore. When he closed his eyes, he saw Anna, not the version of her from the courtroom photos, worn down and tearful, but the one from before everything broke apart. The smile she used to give him across a room without saying a word. The quiet way she leaned her head into his shoulder when she trusted him more than she feared him. Those memories hurt more than anything the court could do to him. They reminded him of what he ruined with his own hands, piece by piece, long before the final moment that landed him here. Anna spent most days trying to keep her life from falling apart. She returned to work as if routine could erase the pain, but every familiar corner carried some echo of him. Neighbors who once waved now hesitated, unsure if she wanted kindness or space. Some avoided her out of discomfort, others approached her with pity she didn't want. She felt watched, sometimes by strangers, sometimes by her own memories. She kept asking herself how she didn't see everything sooner, how she kept making excuses for him, how love had blurred the truth until it was too late. Each question carved a new scar inside her, one she didn't know how to heal. There were nights she woke up shaking, unsure if the fear came from something she dreamed or something she remembered. The support groups helped a little, talking helped a little. But healing is slow when someone has lived too long under the weight of another person's control. There were days she blamed herself, days she hated him, days she felt nothing at all, which scared her more than anything else. The public, as always, shaped its own story. Some saw Daniel as a cold-hearted manipulator who deserved every year the sentence would bring. Others painted him as a man crushed by pressure, jealousy, and the kind of emotional storms no one ever teaches you how to handle. The truth sat somewhere between those views, but people rarely looked for that middle ground. It didn't matter, though. The verdict was clear, and the judge's voice echoed through the courtroom with a weight that left no room for doubt. Daniel's actions had taken something irreversible from the world. No amount of regret or explanation could give it back. The judge didn't hide his disbelief during the sentencing, especially after Daniel tried once again to deny the plea he had already agreed to. "This is not what I agreed to," Daniel insisted, even though everyone in the room knew exactly what he had signed. It was a strange moment, sad almost, like watching someone argue against their own reflection. The judge looked at him with a mix of stern authority and tired disappointment. It was clear he wasn't dealing with a monster, but a broken man who had allowed his worst instincts to carry him too far. There was no last-minute deal, no sudden twist. The law moved forward with the firmness that people need when chaos has shaken their trust. Daniel was sentenced, and the courtroom went still in that strange way rooms do when something heavy finally ends. Anna didn't look at him as he was taken away. She didn't need to. She had looked at him enough times before to understand who he really was and who he no longer could be. Outside the courthouse, reporters fought for the best angle, microphones rising like a small forest above the crowd. They asked the same questions again and again, twisting pieces of the case into dramatic lines for their headlines. The story became less about real people and more about entertainment for those who had only watched from a safe distance. Some blamed Anna. Some blamed Daniel's childhood. Others blamed the justice system or the pressures of money and power. The truth was simpler but also harder to accept. People hurt each other in ways no law or rule can fully prevent. People carry pain that others never see, and sometimes that pain drives them into moments they can never undo. The case sparked long debates across the country. Groups began arguing about emotional abuse, mental control, and the way jealousy can turn into something far more dangerous if left unchecked. Lawyers wrote articles. Psychologists appeared on morning shows. Everyone used the case to prove a point. But the people at the center of it, the ones who lived through the fear, the guilt, and the loss, were never part of those conversations. They were left to rebuild in silence, while the rest of the world moved on to the next big story. In the years that followed, Anna learned to breathe again. Not in big, sudden ways, but in quiet moments, like when the morning light fell in a soft line across her kitchen table, or when she walked outside without feeling the need to look over her shoulder. She still carried the weight of what happened, but it didn't crush her like before. It sat with her, reminding her of how fragile trust can be, how quickly love can twist into something darker when fear and control slip into its roots. Daniel's life shrank to the size of a prison cell. He read a lot, wrote letters he never sent, spent long hours trying to understand when exactly he lost himself. Sometimes he blamed the world. Sometimes he blamed his father. Sometimes he whispered apologies into the darkness, not because he thought Anna would ever hear them, but because he needed to believe that he wasn't born to become the man he became. But responsibility has a way of sitting with people, even when they try to avoid it. He carried it every day, a weight heavier than the walls around him. Justice was served in the legal sense. The sentence matched the crime. The law spoke clearly. But justice in the emotional sense, justice for the years lost, the trust broken, the fear planted in someone's life, rarely feels complete. The court couldn't give Anna back the girl she was before everything happened. It couldn't give Daniel a chance to undo that one moment when he let anger take control. All it could do was place a boundary around the damage and say, "This is where it stops." In the end, the story wasn't just about one man's crime or one woman's suffering. It was a reminder of how fragile people can be, how easily love can become dangerous when mixed with power and fear, and how society often fails to see warning signs until it's too late. It showed how families carry wounds that shape the way they love, how jealousy can grow in silence, and how secrets have a way of exploding when pushed too far. Even after the case faded from the news, people still spoke of it when the night was quiet and the truth felt easier to say. Some said it taught them to look more closely at the people they loved. Others said it made them more aware of how pain can shape a person's choices. But for those who lived through it, there was no neat lesson. There was only survival. Anna learned to trust again, slowly, one day at a time. She didn't forgive Daniel, but she stopped letting him live in her mind. Daniel learned what it meant to face the full cost of a single choice, one made in a storm of emotions he never learned to control. And the town, in its own quiet way, carried the memory forward, not as gossip, but as a warning of what can happen when control, fear, and love collide in the wrong hands. The story closed not with peace, but with truth. And sometimes, truth is the only ending life can offer.